The best way to understand the rise of the Roman peoples and their contribution to the human endeavor is pretty simple, actually. If the Greeks were the theorists who wondered about what was possible for human life, the Romans put those theories into practice. The Greeks were the architects, the Romans were the builders. I'd like to use one particular example from the height of Roman culture and its golden age to study this, and that's Virgil's Aeneid. Um, Publius Vergilius Maro was born in 70 BCE and wrote under the patronage of Caesar Augustus. That is, the most powerful man in the Roman Empire, that is, the emperor, paid him to write poems, which is a pretty sweet gig. However, it wasn't just any poems he was supposed to write, but one sweeping epic tale that did for Rome what the Iliad and the Odyssey did for the Greeks. So before we talk about that epic, the Aeneid, let's just pay attention to that part, and we're going to circle back. But the Romans saw the great order and organization of the Greeks, and they studied just how they came to be by the types of people that they were. The great epics of Homer were passed down in oral tradition as stories around the campfire and developed and memorized over time. Only then did they become so naturally powerful through familiar tradition that they became a foundation for a people. The Romans wanted to skip right over that kind of natural development and just make it from scratch. Hey, we like how y'all became a people, and we're going to try to do that too. And it kind of worked. The Aeneid is still largely regarded, and it was in its time, as a masterpiece that said, look, this is why we should be proud. This is our heritage. We come from gods. We come from heroes. And look at the beautiful art that is telling this story in the first place. So the tale of the great epic that Augustus hired Virgil to write picks up where Homer left off. Virgil's step was to imitate and elevate the tale of the Iliad, the story of war, as well as the Odyssey, a story of wandering and homecoming, in one go. The traditional story, which was very famous to Latins at the time, everybody knew this myth, was that the Trojan soldier Aeneas, who was the son of Venus, the goddess of love, escaped Troy after it fell to the Mycenaean Greeks, and he left Troy and started wandering around the Mediterranean with several of his companions. Everywhere he goes, he tries to settle because he's tired of wandering, but he has been prophesied to be the father of a great nation. Go figure. He stops in Carthage, which was battling with the Italians or the Romans at that time. When Virgil was writing, Carthage was one of the main competitors or the main the rivals in the Mediterranean, and Virgil is actually tracing some of that rivalry back to Aeneas, who fell in love with Queen Dido, the queen of Carthage, and then spurned her love. And she was so sad that she committed suicide, and very epic. But that's where the enmity between Carthage and Rome comes from, according to Virgil. Once he arrives on the Italian peninsula, they start to make camp, and he's welcomed by the Latin tribes, but this causes stress and strife with another tribe, the Rutulians, and there's a great battle. Go figure. Aeneas wins, Abi, and he is seen as the father of the Latin people who become the Roman people. Ta-da! So there are a few things I want to focus on here when it comes to the humanistic strides that are specifically Roman. First one is that the Greeks theorized and made great claims about the power of the individual person. So that comes from Aristotle and the ethics and the idea that you can choose virtue and that you can choose good and that it's an individual's choice. And then also about heroic virtue, and that comes from the Odyssey and the Iliad, right? That Achilles or Odysseus had this singular, independent, heroic genius that really made them prominent. Virgil, writing as the court poet under the employ of an emperor who is the son of grandson of Julius Caesar, is smack dab in the middle of the experiment about individual heroic virtue. So let's just think about that for a moment. The Greeks are imagining this, whether it's in philosophy or in literature, and we don't know about Achilles, how he actually was, for instance, right? He could have been a fraction of how he's depicted. But he was made into that singular heroic individual by Homer. In Rome, they're actually trying to put this into practice. So Julius Caesar saw this decaying republic in which the common good was the responsibility of different public groups. Corruption was creeping in as a matter of course. People were getting rich off of conquering, and they were being lazy about governing. So here comes a general that loves his country and thinks he can do it better. So he takes power to bring about a Rome that he thinks is worth existing. He builds roads, he builds infrastructure, but it's all under tyranny. The point being that the Roman contribution really took off, less so when it was the res publica, the republic, which was nevertheless a significant contribution to the human enterprise. But the Roman contribution was super productive when it was under the rule of prominent and powerful individuals, that is, emperors. And that's not all of them, let's be really clear, but nevertheless, that's where we really see what Rome is under the rule of kings or emperors, Caesars. And here's one way that Virgil illustrates this idea, and this is just in the very first book, probably 20 lines into the first text. And he makes this metaphor. I'm going to read it. As when in tumults rise the ignoble crowd, mad are their motions, and their tongues are loud, and stones and brands and rattling follies fly, and all the rustic arms that fury can supply. If then some grave and pious man appear, they hush their noise and lend a listening ear. He soothes with sober words their angry mood, and quenches their innate desire of blood. So when the father of the flood appears. And he goes on to describe how Neptune, the god of the sea, comes out of the water to make the storm go away. But he's comparing it to a man who enters into a public riot and calms the riot. He's basically praising both Julius and his grandson Augustus, but more interesting to me is how he's using this metaphor as something that's well known, right? So when you're making a comparison either with simile or metaphor, you always use the thing that's better known to the thing that's less known, right? And so one of the things that seems to be an operating standard here, the thing that's more known, is, yeah, there are people that walk into crowds and people listen to them. People have experience of this demonstration of leadership and individual heroic virtue, of the way in which a people or a crowd can give themselves over to the influence of one human. This Caesarian way, right, coming from Caesar, is not different from what came before the democratic and republic experiments of the Greeks and early Romans. Right? There were kings and priests and shamans and dynasties, pharaohs who claimed singular power, tyrants who ruled with cunning or might. However, the idea of the virtuous man worthy of leading was a different way to get to a similar system. So that's one area in which there's a unique contribution. Back to the other feature of Roman ingenuity on display in this work. The one that really speaks to the uniquely Roman enterprise is the appropriation and elevation of the Greeks. I mentioned this right at the get-go, right? If the Greeks were the ones that had the idea, the Romans were the ones that put it in practice. So in the Aeneid, we see the full development of poetic invention. The rhythms of Homeric memorization, which originated no less for convenience than its own musicality, is now brought to pure design. No practical purpose anymore, just the dare of doing. Virgil is saying, I'm going to write it this way, not because I have to memorize it, just because I think it's going to sound better. So imagine having the spirit of audacity to try to do in one epic tale what Homer did in two. And that's the spirit that Virgil is adopting and extending. He has a richer database of knowledge, he has a richer database to make allusions from, and cultural reference points that he can use to deepen his work. Right? He has Greek tragedies that he can bring into his works. Right? This is, for me, I feel like, yes, the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Epic of Gilgamesh, those are all exciting examples of literature. But this piece, the Aeneid, is one of the most complete works of like capital L literature, where it knows it's in a tradition and is taking advantage of that fact. So this is seen elsewhere too. The mathematic principles of Pythagoras and Euclid and Apollonius, who are all Greek, are developed into practical purposes of architecture to create the aqueducts, the temples, and public places like the Colosseum. The order and organization of communities that the Greeks posited in their philosophical treatises get applied to form the most impressive military regiments the world had ever seen up to that point. Rome lived into the dream of the Greek culture and brought it to life for a brief moment before it came crashing down. And so the last thing that we should take away about Rome's contribution to the idea of human is that the idea of empire. Rome brought such an extensive region under one flag that the idea of it became possible, and generations after in the West pursued that kind of power and still do to this day. Right? Rome's empire stretched almost to India, through Africa, and all the way to the British Isles. Right? It covered a massive amount of territory, which was one of the reasons why it failed, because there's just no way to keep control over that. But the idea that one nation, one people could actually organize in such a way and in such an extent that captured the imagination of centuries and centuries and centuries of peoples after. And so now, almost the rest of time, up until today, by the way, becomes a story of human empire. And so Rome's moment in human development might well have proved that humans are not egalitarian people. That is, that they're not at their best when equal in power and representation. And I'm not saying that's true. I'm saying there's a demonstration here that's worth considering. But rather, Rome's contribution suggests humans are an imperial people. They're always stuck in relationships of power, always a conqueror, and always someone conquered.